Hello, and welcome once again to another episode of The Bared Soul. I'm Steve Young. Today, I would like to talk to you about parental wounds. The wounds that were conceived by our parents, the wounds that we held on to, and how they affected our lives. And it takes me immediately back to birth for myself, as this is something that I have contemplated multiple times over life, and even ever since my mother told me this story, but it's also come up recently, which is why I want to share this. Going back to the literal day that my mother brought me home from the hospital as a baby, she brought me home into our apartment to find that there was another woman in the house with my father. And the tension that was in our household in my childhood was surely amplified by that scenario and the energy around that scenario. But more so, the fact that this energy and these circumstances were very likely also happening during the time I was in the womb of my mother. And that was only compounded by seeing the fractured relationship of my mother and father growing up as a child. Not quite knowing for sure what the problems or issues were, but knowing that they appeared to have very much this sort of tough love between them, and had a hard time dealing with their own problems, let alone being present for their 3 children much of the time. And compounding that was the closest set of grandparents of mine were also of the fighting variety and could not stand being around each other. And so my perception at a young age was that there wasn't such a thing as a healthy relationship as a role model in my life or as a template in my life. And there wasn't a good example of what love was from parents to children, not only in my generation or the generation above them, from anything that I saw. And so when my mother had told me the story about bringing me home to that, and then also began to further divulge other aspects over time in conversations of why she made the choices that she made in our childhood, why she contemplated leaving and ultimately stayed to keep the family together, but also wasn't the loving, nurturing mother that the children may have needed, myself included. And it's the wounds that she showed over time that I began to see as some of the energies I carried in myself as driving forces in this life. When she was adamant about being monogamous, for example, and experiencing that early in their marriage, at least from the standpoint of when I was born forward, and me learning about the grandmother who was the guardian angel in my life, who took care of us when my parents were often fighting, also having multiple issues and relationships, and even had multiple marriages herself over life. I became driven by breaking the mold when it came to relationships. I became driven by this inner desire from all of that contrast that I experienced to say, I'm not going to live this way. I'm going to create love, a relationship based on a foundation of love that's solid, and have a family that's solid and full of love and established and rooted. And I don't want to be this way where the love is shown by these acts of distancing or violent nature or coping with things, but the love is actually two people expressing the light from their souls towards each other, and that when there were conflicts, they would work together towards the solutions rather than pointing fingers or blame. And that was a large driving force in my life. And it's always been a driving force in my life, of the lack of nurturing, the lack of emotional and physical intimacy that came from my parents, to desire that in my life in relationships going forward. But also knowing that coming from that place, I wasn't going to be able to just jump into a relationship and provide that to somebody else. That I was going to have to learn how to be what it was that I wanted. And that's a wound pattern inside of me that I know has been unraveling and been healing in steps as I've gone along, as I've been in relationships, learning the areas where I'm still wounded and still triggered by these patterns that I could see very easily in my parents in hindsight. And to know that part of the desire for breaking that mold is walking through those actual wounds and not avoiding them. As I look back further, with my parents and their wounding themselves of what they came from, my mother's mother passed away when my mom was only 13 years old, due to cirrhosis of the liver. And my father was lied to his entire life about who his real father was. So both of them were carrying heavy burdens that neither one of them really truly healed from, to the point of when they had children and beyond. And I do believe that I carry the energies of those burdens inside of me. At least I had for a lot of my life. I actually dug into, on my own accord, attempting to figure out who my father's real father was. Not that I didn't believe my dad did his due diligence in looking, but I felt I needed to know for myself on some level. And in ways that I won't go into on this video, I feel like I came to the actual answer of that, and I shared it with him before he passed away in 2013. I think even a year or two before he passed away. And I do feel that it gave him a sense of relief on some level before he passed away, even though he didn't verbally express that to me. But the burdens that our parents carry forward that they didn't know how to release or heal from or transmute that energy inside of them do imprint on us when we're born. and they do affect us. And for many people like myself, some of those burdens do drive us into the actions that we take in our lives and the directions we head in our lives. And for myself, the vast majority of my life has been geared towards love and family because of those experiences I had with my parents growing up. As I now have conversations with my mother at this age, for the both of us, the more I speak with her and the more space I've held for her, the more she opens up to speak about things that happened in my childhood and beyond, things that happened in her childhood and with her parents and with her grandparents. And it helps me understand more and more about the decisions that drove her and affected her. And I didn't get as many conversations with my father because he passed away in 2013. And before he had passed away, I had had some spiritual conversations with him, digging deep inside, getting past walls and asking questions about life and decisions. But he, at that point, would only open up so far. And I didn't try to pry, but I was authentic in my questions and authentic in my inquiries. So as I've contemplated these parental wounds that have been passed down the lineage on both sides, I have 2 children of my own who are almost 12 years old and 7 years old. And the more I've become conscious of the wounds that have been passed down and the more inner work I've done on those wounds, the more conscious my parenting becomes. As someone who in the beginning didn't want them to feel the burden of any of these wounds, but now more authentically wants to simply help guide them into fully being who they are, knowing that they can't be shielded from every wound and every trauma in the world, and that they are going to have their own experiences, and they're going to have to work through those experiences themselves. But the consciousness that I have of these parental wounds passed down to me is not something that was discussed with me by my parents, and this is only going to be beneficial for my children. So with all of that said, I'm going to have Rick Stutler join in over here and ask some questions as he's been listening to the conversation, and we'll see where we go with this.
Hi everybody. No, I have been listening to your conversation, and some of these questions may seem irrelevant now that you've probably explained some of it away. But the story, let's get back to the story of what your mom saw when she came home from the hospital. There's been times we've talked about people that can remember everything from the womb and everything like that. I was wondering, now that you were aware of that, how has that affected your life, and did it make you sad or angry, or did you remember any of it from the womb perspective?
I cannot say, at least consciously, at least right now, that I remember from the womb the particulars of that situation. I do know that I was sad a lot in my childhood, early childhood, about the situation because it just felt wrong to me. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know why it was happening. And I could sense the pain in my mother. And I also know that she took out some of that pain even on her own children, which also distanced us from her. Mm-hmm. So where there may have been a bonding moment in a allegiance, if I want to say it that way, to my mother. On the same token, there was emotional distance from her as well. And I don't blame her for it, but at the time, it was felt. I do remember the person being around when we were young. So not only was this person around when I was born, but as I grew up, I saw this person, and I saw just the person's presence creating conflict in our family's life. And because of that, I felt the anxiety and the tension within my own body of, why are we going through this? Why is this happening? Why doesn't this person just go away? What's going on?
Yeah.
And also couldn't quite make sense of it, at that young of an age.
Well, no, you can't. And that kind of leads up to my next question. I know myself, I'm a divorced parent, and I thought it was better to leave the situation and just be around my daughters all I could be, rather than have that sort of a situation. Do you feel that sticking together was actually worse than leaving? I know I felt that when that time came for me.
That's a conversation I had with my mother quite recently, within the past year or two, of why didn't you just leave? Because she had contemplated several times on leaving. But part of what she had contemplated in her own transparency to me was like leaving the family entirely. Like leaving the boys leaving us with our dad and just being gone. And I know she had also contemplated leaving with us. And what she said was that God told her to stay. If I'm not mistaken, I believe she said God told her to stay in this situation, that she was meant to stay. And I've gone both ways inside when it comes to whether it made it worse by staying, because I saw things growing up that to me made it very clear that something wasn't right. Something, a lot of negativity was happening, a lot of volatility was happening, and someone in their right mind shouldn't tolerate that. So there was a part of me that said, in hindsight, it made no sense that you stayed. And then there's also that hopeless romantic side of me that says, when you love somebody and they love you, you do whatever it takes to make it work. In the long run, with my parents, there were a lot of health issues with my father, and after a lot of the health issues happened, his behavior and demeanor and personality changed, and he became a much more mellow, calmer, kinder person. And my mother stuck through all of that to get to the point of being with that calmer person, who she said was more of the person that she fell in love with to begin with. And I know from experience that it takes two to make that work. Like, both people have to actually want that same thing together, to want to work towards that solution together.
Well, I'd like to point out too, that was a different generation. Back then, people would stay together in the most impossible situations. But I guess another point I want to bring up is, how did that make you and your brothers feel? Did you feel it was your fault at all that this was going on?
I personally never felt that it was my fault that it was going on. I know that my brothers at different times took what felt like was more of the brunt of the lashing out of the energy than I did. And I can only imagine that at times they may have contemplated on whether it was something that they did or said, or were a cause of it.
Well, I know you're also talking about young minds too, and young minds can't separate all that. Young minds, like, um, I don't know, sometimes kids feel like the parents leave because of them, and a lot of times it has nothing to do with them. Very little to do with them, but for some reason they take on this guilt that mom and dad aren't right because of me.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just kind of curious if you felt that way. I know I've heard that from one of my daughters, and I tried to tell her, I said, no, you guys were the best blessing in my life, you know, it has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, and also on the same token, I can say, because I did feel this way, of how can I help save this situation in many instances, and finding out that there's nothing I could have done to make it better between my parents.
The only thing you could do early was just stay out of the way, huh? And that's how a lot of us survive situations like that. I mean, most people that are spiritualists like we are, verbatim, I hear the same story over and over and over again. And my story was much like that. But, you know, it's just, kids take on the blame for something they had nothing to do with. So I was just kind of curious about that. And one question I had, I think, no, it's not my final question. I have a few more here. Are your boys better off for your experiences? It feels that your strength is their strength because you were strong enough to come through that. And I'm not saying you came through with flying colors. I mean, every day is a new day, isn't it? But no, with I've seen how you are around your sons, and they don't get any of that. Not that I'm seeing. So maybe karma has worked out that way. Maybe you came down and had to go through that so your boys could be better off.
I've always said that I'm here to heal ancestral traumas and lineage traumas and break the mold, because I've always felt that way, even from being a child and just feeling completely out of place, even within my own family, of like, I'm here to be different. And with that feeling, knowing aspects of the wounds and how my parents dealt with those wounds, knowing that I didn't want to deal with things that way, that I wanted to be different because I wanted to come from deeper within and say, this stops here. I do feel that on that aspect, my boys are better off for that. Yet at the same time, I understand that they are still going to experience traumas that I have no control over whether they happen or not. And coming from that human place of being heartbroken in a sense when I see it happen, knowing that they have to experience certain wounds and traumas that I can't step in and protect them from, they have to experience it for themselves.
Oh yeah.
So it's like you win some, you lose some. I know for sure that there were certain wounds that I needed to stop passing down. Like,
yeah, that's key. A lot of people can't do that. A lot of people, you have to break the mold. But what I'm saying is your strength benefits them. They have a strong place to go. Where a lot of us, all we were doing is like, oh crap, what now? What's coming my way now? How can I get away from this? I mean, they say Harry Houdini was a great escape artist. People like us, we had to get away from that just to keep our own sanity. And you know, when you're a kid, you just don't understand this stuff.
And that's the point to that too, is, you know, in human design, my profile is a 3-5, and it's a profile of somebody who lives the trial and error life and experiments a lot and makes a lot of mistakes in order to share with people and express what actually works. And from that perspective, knowing that I went through a lot of things, that I can now share with my kids the experiences, not just, hey, don't do this because I know it didn't work, but here's how I felt going through this. And I'm being open in my communication with my kids, inviting them to express their emotions and feelings with me. These are conversations that I never got to have with my parents because no one ever expressed these things to them. So the benefit of going through a lot of the things that I went through, including the spiritual journey that I'm on now, is giving them an aspect of life that my parents didn't give me.
Well, I mean, and that brings up kind of my next point is, first of all, there is no such thing as a perfect parent. I think we all want to be, but there is no perfect parent. I mean, you just do the best you can, but I've always said this, people live what they know.
Mm-hmm.
If your mom and dad lived that, they know that. And that's what and like I said, a lot of people aren't strong enough to recognize, hey, I got to break a pattern here. And they don't do it, and they just, but then there's folks like you and me and a few other people we know that did break the pattern. And our children are much better off for it. Matter of fact, sometimes with myself, it's just like, you don't understand what tough is. Because they say how tough life is, and I thought, you have no idea how tough life can be. But there was kids that had it worse than I did. So
there's also, we talk about breaking patterns, but there's also, and it could very well be partial wounding or even full wounding, but patterns in life that we take on from our parents that we're not consciously aware of, but we see it later on. My mother, to this day, still isolates a lot, keeps to herself. She does it mainly for peace in her life because she's very sensitive to energies. She's somebody who actually doesn't like to be around a large group of people because she'll start turning red and sweating and getting to the point of almost fainting. And I know that's an energetic thing. I've been around it long enough. I don't get to that level of panic, but I'm also very sensitive. I, for the most part, don't like being around large groups of people and in large settings. I do isolate. I do keep to myself. And then when I'm in isolation, I draw from the inspiration that comes in my solitude to then share out with others, where I can be in group settings and I can feel comfortable. I'm just as sensitive to energy as she is, and I learned that over a long time.
And really, what you're hitting on was what I was going to say next. I mean, even as bad as it could have been, there are some good things about your mom and dad that you picked up on and that you carried that as a part of you. I mean, couldn't have been all horrible, but it was probably pretty bad. Because my own parents, I know there's some good things about both of them that has been instilled in me. But sometimes you wonder, they say, well, you pick your parents before you come down here. It's like, I did? Really?
I do believe that I picked my parents. I do believe in the soul contracts. I feel it inside of me.
Yeah.
And it's not just learning about the wounds and healing the wounds. It's also about accepting the gifts that came down through the lineage. Yeah. And it also takes awareness to figure out what those are.
Yeah.
And for me, that's been part of the fun side of this spiritual journey, is the deeper I go in the exploration of myself and then looking back at my lineage to become aware of the gifts that came from these sets of parents on down.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like we remember all the bad, but they gave us some good stuff too. I guess my final question is have you found a space of forgiveness for your parents, and have you forgiven yourself for the anger you've experienced with them?
Yes, so there were 2 separate occasions in my life where I went to my parents before my father passed away, where I expressed forgiveness to them from an authentic place, even before I had the deeper level of acceptance in forgiveness in myself. Because I knew back then, I think the first time I went to them, I was around 15 years old, and I got both of my parents in the kitchen, and I said, look, we've never talked about the things that happened in our childhood as your children. I said, I'm going to state these things verbally out loud to you, the both of you, even though I had fear inside of me of addressing them because I didn't know how it was going to be received, but I felt I needed to. And I stated some of the big things that happened in our childhood that really affected me. And I was even speaking on behalf of my brothers at the time, but it was just me talking. Mm-hmm. And then I said, I forgive you for those things because I don't want to carry a burden in my life going forward towards you guys. Mm-hmm. It would be very easy for me to say, I never want to talk to you ever again, and be on my way. But I know that I would still harbor something inside of me if I did that. Yeah. So I wanted to address them face to face, and I did it then at 15 years old, and I did it again. I don't know how old I was, but I did it again before my father had passed away, where I'm like, I need you to understand that I forgive you for those things. Mm-hmm. I forgive you for what you went through, because the second time I then also was able to add in that I understand you were only doing the best you could with the information you had in your life and the resources available to you. Mm-hmm. And I truly understood that. It didn't make the situation any better, but it was the best that they could do in that moment.
So as far as self-forgiveness, and I don't know where all that plays in here, but I've often heard that a lot of times for your life you got to forgive yourself because you were probably pretty mad at sometimes, and you probably said some pretty hateful things in your mind. I know I did. And but once you become spiritually awakened, and I'll just throw that out there, you look at life through a whole different set of eyeballs, and your heart's different, and your ears are different, and you understand that that was their stuff. Like I told you earlier, I mean, people live what they know. That's all they knew. Mm-hmm. Which doesn't make it right, but it's all they knew. And so I think by maybe self-forgiveness, like you have done, apparently you can be better with your family.
And I, being transparent and authentic, will say that there's levels to it. I've forgiven myself at different times and on different levels, but I don't think I'm done. I don't think I'm fully done, because waves will hit where I'm like, okay, I'm still holding on to something here because I can feel it inside of me.
Yeah.
And then my ego will say, no, you're not, you're past this. But my body and the energy in my body won't lie. It'll show me, especially since I became aware of my energy, whether I have a shake going on or a tightness, in my chest going on, of like holding on to this energy, like bracing for impact kind of feeling, where I know that in those moments, if I were to say I've gotten past this wound or I've forgiven myself, I wouldn't be authentic.
Well, not that well's kind of deep. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, I don't care who you are, I've got so much soul work to do. And I don't care how advanced you are in spirituality or whatever the case may be. We all have our issues. We all have our stuff. They had their stuff. We got some of it. We have to get rid of it. And we have our own stuff we got to get rid of. Nobody's a perfect human being, but we try to do better. And like our colleague says, our partner, when you know better, you do better. Mm-hmm. So that's the whole thing. So no, I think everything was pretty cool, and
I think the last thing I would like to add to that is that when we reach these points inside of ourselves where we can feel the wounding almost on a visceral level, like you feel it, it does nobody any good to not actually face it head on. You affect not only yourself but those around you when you cling to wounds or even push wounds away. And it shows.
It can be overwhelming.
And it's probably one of the most easily visible things is when it's reflected in children. So when the children are reflecting to you a wound that you have inside of you, because they're coming from maybe the most authentic space with the least amount of conditioning possible in younger years, to show you what you might be going through, but passing through to them, even if it's subconsciously, because you don't know how to deal with the wound. I see it in my children from time to time, and at certain times it breaks my heart, because I see that I've done that, whether it's snapping and yelling, hitting a trigger point inside of myself, then the shame and the guilt that I feel inside of myself that I even did that, knowing that something that was important to me was to not pass down trauma to my kids as much as possible.
Well, you see, that's where you're one up on me, because both my daughters are fully grown now, and one has children. And once in a while I think about how they grew up, and they didn't grow up too bad. I mean, they had a great mom, and I tried to do the best I could, because I would not repeat my life with my children. I'm not doing that. So, but it's just, there's once in a while I still get those little dings where I think back on something like, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. I wish I could fix that. It's done. I mean, you can talk to them about it, and half the time they don't even remember what I'm talking about.
I think that as my children get older and they're more aware in conversations, those are the perfect times for me to be honest about me feeling the wounding, or me feeling these things that I still need to work through. Like, look, Dad's going through this, and this is why I snapped this way. I should not have done that. It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry. But most importantly, it's me actually verbally expressing the authentic energy that I'm feeling inside, so that my kids know what it feels like and sounds like and looks like to see energy matching words.
Yeah. And you're not coming from a space of anger, you're coming from a space of compassion, which, I mean, man, if we could just love one another like we're supposed to, what a world we'd have.
And I know with a lot of the conditioning in this world that happens, that a lot of these reactions are autopilot, but I really try to focus back on what would be the loving thing to do here every time. And even when I hit a breaking point and raise my voice and yell, it's, okay, Steve, what would be the loving thing to do here? Because I do look at my kids at times when I'm yelling at them and see little Steve getting yelled at. And that stops me in my tracks. That makes me...
That's awareness. That is awareness. Because, when you recognize that, it's like, wow, that's gold. It's just like, yes, things are working out like I want them to work out. I mean, it's just, I'm not taking my life out on my children. And unfortunately, a lot of people can't do that.
It stops me in my tracks, because I know what it's like to be communicated to from
A space of anger,
a space of emotional unavailability, a space of someone saying they love you but not showing it, and all of those aspects then weigh on my mind as I'm parenting, and I want to make sure that I don't do those things. And in the moments where I get humbled by my ego working on autopilot and having a reaction that was just something that I saw when I was young, I have to catch myself and say, no, I'm not going to do that.
No, and we can't. I mean, well, I think this has been pretty fruitful. I mean, and I'm hoping people watch this, and because I'm sure a lot of families are going through this, and it might touch their hearts in a way where they can, it's not too late to turn it around. You can always turn it around.
Yeah, with the channel being called The Bared Soul, this is, one of those topics where I wanted to really bare my soul on things that I went through in my own personal experiences and the wounds that come from our parents, and to express a little bit about, how they affect us as we grow up, and how we have the power inside of us to shift these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad we're doing it like this, because I have one coming up I really have to word it properly, because it's a very, very touchy subject with a lot of people. But it's important to me, just like you said, and I have to be authentic with what I say. People aren't gonna agree with it all, and they may not agree with what we talked about tonight. But it's just, that's what the bared soul is, we're bearing our souls. So, no, I think it was pretty cool.
Well, that wraps up this episode of The Bared Soul, and we'll catch you again next time. I'm Steve Young,
I'm Rick Stutler.
and have a great one.
Thank you.